The morning Aunt Renata looked across the conference table at me and said, "Blood or not, a thief is a thief." She was smiling. I did not flinch. I did not reach for my water glass. I folded my hands in my lap, pressed my left thumbnail into my right palm where no one could see, and observed the way her smile never quite reached the outer corners of her eyes, the way it stopped exactly at the cheekbones, performed and geometric. The smile of a woman who had rehearsed this moment many times before delivering it. Before I tell you what she took from me, let me tell you what I had built, because the story only makes sense in that order. In the 7 years before that Tuesday morning, I had personally renegotiated 14 supplier contracts that reduced the family's operating costs by a combined $231,412. I had sourced and closed the lease on the Garfield Avenue location, 4,800 square feet of commercial space at $11 below the market rate per square foot. I had trained every front-of-house manager the business had promoted in the last 5 years. I had done it quietly, methodically, without asking for a title change or a raise that reflected any of it, because I believed, in the way that dependable people believe before experience teaches them otherwise, that the work would be seen. That the family would see it. That she would see it. My name is Cecily Van. I was 31 years old that morning, and by noon, I was a thief. If you are listening to this right now, wherever you are, I want to know where you are listening from. Drop your city in the comments. I have heard from people in Atlanta and Sacramento and a woman in a suburb outside of Minneapolis who told me she pulled over on the highway because she couldn't drive and listen at the same time. Wherever you are, I want you to know I see you. I am talking directly to you. And if you have ever sat in a room where your own blood treated you like an inconvenient stranger, if you have ever been the one who fixed everything and received nothing, if you have ever had your name spoken as an accusation by the same mouth that once called you family, then stay with me, because what I am about to tell you is going to matter to you in ways you are not yet expecting. If this story connects with something you have lived through yourself, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Every comment, every share, every person who clicks that notification bell is telling me to keep going, and I intend to. Now, let me take you back to how this nightmare started. The family business was called Van and Strickland Catering and Event Services, though the Strickland half of the name had been gone for 22 years, bought out by my grandfather, Gerald Eustace Van. In a quiet transaction that most of the younger generation in the family had either forgotten or never been told. My grandfather was a deliberate man. He did not speak often, but when he did, the words were load-bearing. He had a line he returned to whenever one of his grandchildren came to him with a grievance about fairness, about who got what, about who was being treated with more care by the adults in the room. He would look at you steadily over the rim of his coffee cup and say, "A reckoning doesn't arrive when you call for it. It arrives when it's ready. Your job is to still be standing when it gets there." I did not understand that line until much later. I wrote it in the inside cover of a small brown notebook I kept in the right-hand drawer of my desk at the office, and I returned to it on the days when I needed it most. Grandfather Gerald died 18 months before that conference room morning. He died quietly at home, in the house on Creston Mill Road where he had lived for 40 years. With the particular tidiness of a man who had arranged his own affairs long in advance, and left the people he loved the instructions they would need if they were paying attention. He left the business to his children in the form that his children had been expecting, the form they had negotiated around him for years, a structure that gave operational management to his eldest, my Aunt Renata, and distributed nominal equity shares to his 3 other children, one of whom was my father. What none of them saw, because none of them had been looking in the right direction, was what he had done before any of that, 20 years before that, with an attorney named Wallace Okafor, in a private meeting that my grandfather had described to no one. But I am getting ahead of myself. I do that when I think about him. I have to go further back. He has been practicing in this city for decades, and he is the kind of person who has seen everything and is not surprised by any of it, which makes him very difficult to manipulate. She had said it in the admiring way she said things about competence. I had filed it. The way I filed things. What Luz did not know, what I had not told her in the text message exchange, and had not told her on the phone call this morning, Was the specific reason the name Okafor had rung in me with a register deeper than a professional referral when she had first given it to me. I had heard that name before. I had heard it once, when I was 17 years old, in a conversation I was not supposed to be part of. A conversation between my grandfather and my father that I had not been meant to overhear, but had overheard through the cracked kitchen door of the Creston Mill Roadhouse on an ordinary Saturday afternoon, my grandfather's voice low and deliberate, saying, "Wallace knows what to do. He has had the file for 2 years already. I need you to trust that I have handled this the right way." I had not known what that sentence meant at 17. I had stored it the way you store things that are above your current comprehension, but that carry a weight suggesting you will need them later. I was 31 years old, sitting at my kitchen table in October, and I thought I was beginning to understand what it meant. Thursday arrived with the quiet efficiency of days that are going to matter. I wore what I had worn to the shareholder meeting, the dark navy trousers, the cream blouse, the watch. Luz met me in the lobby of the building where Okafor and Associates kept their offices, a 6-story professional building on a side street in the older commercial district of the city. The kind of building that had been built before the current architectural vocabulary of glass and horizontal steel, a brick building with wide window frames and the particular institutional heft of something constructed to last. The firm occupied the 4th floor, Suite 407, and the reception area was furnished in the way that serious, long-established legal offices furnish themselves, with the complete indifference to trend that communicates that what is done here has nothing to prove. The receptionist, a woman of approximately 60 with a composed and faultlessly courteous manner, checked our names and asked us to wait. We sat. Luz and I did not speak much in the waiting area. We had covered what needed to be covered on the drive over. She had confirmed, again, the details of what she had witnessed at Patricia's dinner. She had it written out in a note in her phone, in the plain, precise language of a woman who had learned that documentation was a form of self-protection. I had asked her to send it to herself as an email so it carried a timestamp, which she had done from the parking garage at 1:57 in the afternoon, before we came upstairs. At 2:14, the receptionist indicated that Attorney Okafor would see us. He was not what I had constructed in my imagination from the few biographical details I had assembled. I had expected someone visibly authoritative, the physical architecture of professional gravitas. What I found was a man in his middle 70s, trim, with close-cropped white hair and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, in a charcoal suit that was well-made and well-maintained and clearly not new. The suit of a man who buys quality once and keeps it because the quality holds. His office was the functional expression of his reception area, dense with organized material, bookshelves floor to ceiling on 2 walls, a desk with no visible disorder, a window with a partial city view, and 2 chairs positioned with a precision that communicated he was accustomed to seating people who needed to be comfortable enough to be honest. He shook my hand. He shook Luz's. He gestured to the chairs. He sat. He placed his reading glasses on the desk in front of him rather than putting them on. And then he looked at me with an attention that was unlike any professional attention I had previously experienced, which is to say it was completely undiluted by the performance of attention. It was simply, purely, undemonstratively, the real thing. He said, "Miss Van, I have been expecting you for some time." The way he said it was not dramatic. There was no particular weight placed on any word. It was simply a factual statement, delivered in the register of someone who is finishing a sentence that was started a long time ago. I said, "Then you knew my grandfather." He said, "I represented your grandfather for 31 years. Gerald Van was one of the most deliberate clients I have ever had the privilege of advising. He was also one of the most farsighted." He paused. He opened the desk drawer on his right side and removed a worn manila folder, thick with pages, its edges softened with age, held together with a binder clip that was not the original. He set it on the desk between us. He did not open it yet. He said, "Before I show you this, I want to tell you that your grandfather gave me very specific instructions about the conditions under which this document was to be presented. Those conditions have now been met. It took somewhat longer than either of us anticipated, but we are here. That is what matters." I looked at the folder. I looked at the wear on its edges. The particular softening that comes from years of handling and storage, and the passage of time in a drawer that was opened and closed, and held its contents in readiness for a moment that might not have come, but that was prepared for as though it certainly would. I said, "What are the conditions he specified?" Attorney Okafor looked at me over the desk with the complete, undramatic attention that I was already beginning to understand was his permanent frequency. He said that the primary operating authority of Van and Strickland had demonstrated, in the professional judgment of his personal attorney, a pattern of material bad faith against a direct descendant with a legitimate stake in the family holdings, and that descendant had, throughout the period of that bad faith, maintained their integrity. He let that sit for a moment. Then he said, "I have been observing the situation for some time. I received a copy of certain company documentation last week from a source I am not yet at liberty to name to you. I had already determined, before receiving that documentation, that the first condition had been satisfied. The documentation confirmed the second element of what I needed." I said, "What documentation?" He said, "A transfer of management authorization document, uploaded to a company shared drive 11 days ago, bearing a notarization stamp from a notary whose license was suspended 8 years ago, and a signature that, according to the forensic document examiner I retained 24 hours after I received the copy, is not consistent with the known signature samples from the file I have held for your grandfather for the past 20 years. I held very still. He said, "Miss Van, your grandfather prepared something for you. He was very precise about it. He used the phrase, and I am quoting him from my notes from our meeting, 'When Cecily needs it, it will be there.' He said your name specifically. Not a class of descendants. Your name." Luz, beside me, made no sound. I was aware of her presence the way you are aware of solid ground, a fundamental fact that does not require your attention because it is dependable. I said, "What is in the folder?" He opened it. He walked me through it at a pace that was steady and thorough, and I will tell you what it contained because you need to understand the full weight of what my grandfather had done and the full span of time over which he had done it. The folder contained a conditional transfer instrument, as the story teaser of this account has indicated, but the instrument itself was denser and more specific than any summary I had encountered. It was 12 pages. It had been drafted over the course of 2 meetings with Attorney Okafor, the first when I was 11 years old and the second when I was 16. It had been notarized by a notary who was at that time active, licensed, and entirely legitimate, with a commission stamp that was valid and documented. It had been witnessed by 2 individuals whose names I will protect here, but who were alive, traceable, and had been contacted by Attorney Okafor the previous week. It named me, Cecily Marie Van, by my full legal name. It described the conditional criteria in language that my grandfather had apparently revised 3 times to achieve the precision he wanted, language that the attorney told me had held up to his professional review on multiple re-examinations over the years. And it contained one paragraph that I want to describe carefully, because it is the one that matters most to the shape of what was coming. The paragraph specified that upon the triggering of the transfer conditions and the acceptance of the instrument by the named beneficiary, the signatory authority of the current operating management of Van and Strickland, and any instruments or authorizations executed by that management in the 12 months prior to the triggering date, would be subject to administrative review and potential revocation. The document specified this not as a punitive measure, but as a structural reset, a return to the original equity architecture my grandfather had established in the founding documents, before the various internal instruments that had concentrated authority in Renata's hands over the years. Instruments including, the attorney noted quietly, an unsigned copy of a management authorization transfer that bore a resemblance to the fraudulent document discovered on the company's shared drive and that appeared, based on preliminary comparison, to be a closely modeled imitation. I sat in that chair in the 4th floor office of Okafor and Associates and looked at the worn manila folder and the 12 pages and the photograph of my grandfather at a fishing cabin that Attorney Okafor had taken out of the folder and set to one side with a Care that was entirely personal, entirely outside the professional transaction of the meeting, the photograph of a man in his late 50s at a lake somewhere, not smiling broadly, just looking at the water with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has arranged things the way he intended. I said, "What do I need to do?" He said, "Read it. Consider it. If you choose to proceed, come back and we will begin the formal acceptance process. There is no deadline except your own readiness." He handed me the folder. All 12 pages. I held it for a moment, the weight of the paper, the particular solidity of a document that has been waiting in a drawer for 20 years. I said, "How long will the acceptance process take once I initiate it?" He said, "The administrative filings are straightforward. I have prepared them. The revocation of signatory authority is automatic upon acceptance and filing. 48 hours from execution to effect under the existing business registration framework." 48 hours. I looked at the folder. I looked at my grandfather's photograph. Luz had her hands folded in her lap and was looking at a point slightly above the attorney's shoulder in the way she looks when she is processing something that she did not fully anticipate. I said, "I will be back on Monday." He nodded. He stood. He reached across the desk and shook my hand again. At the door, I paused. I said, "The source. The one who sent you the documentation last week. You said you're not at liberty to name them yet." He said, "Not yet." He paused. He almost smiled, a restrained shift at the corner of one side of his mouth. He said, "But I will tell you that they have known your grandfather a very long time. And they have been watching with considerable patience." I thanked him. Luz and I walked back through the reception area, past the composed 60-year-old at the front desk who nodded at us with the serenity of someone who has witnessed many significant moments depart through those doors. We took the elevator to the lobby. We walked out of the building onto the side street in the October afternoon, the white-gray sky still working above us. Luz said, after approximately a block of walking in silence, "Cecily." I said, "I know." She said, "Your grandfather." I said, "Yes." She was quiet for another half block. Then she said, "He built you a door. He built you a door and he hid it and he left it unlocked." I did not answer this immediately because I was thinking about the fishing cabin photograph, about the particular quality of my grandfather's stillness in that image, a man who had spent decades in rooms where the power moved around him and had chosen, very deliberately, not to reach for it for himself, but to set it aside in a specific place where it would matter to a specific person when that person needed it. I thought about the line in the brown notebook. A reckoning doesn't arrive when you call for it. I thought about the word farsighted, which Attorney Okafor had used, and how insufficient it was to describe what I had just seen in that folder. I said, "Eventually, he built me more than a door." We reached my car. I placed the manila folder, my grandfather's 12 pages, in the canvas tote bag beside the 11 olive green notebooks. I drove home at 3:47 in the afternoon. I did not eat dinner that evening. I sat at my kitchen table and read every page of the conditional transfer instrument twice, and then a third time, and then I placed it back in its worn folder and held the folder in both hands for a long time, feeling the soft edges of it, the weight of the accumulated years of its waiting. On the same evening I sat reading those pages, across the city, in the dining room of the house on Creston Mill Road, the house my grandfather had lived in for 40 years and that Renata had assumed operational management of as part of the estate arrangement. My aunt was hosting a dinner for the family, with wine and the specific warmth that attends a gathering of people who believe they have resolved something difficult and emerged intact. My cousin Derek was there. Patricia was there. Several extended family members, cousins, in-laws, the operational network of Renata's social architecture, all seated at the table where my grandfather had once said the things he said, all lifting their glasses to a future that had been arranged to their satisfaction, toasting an ending that had not, in any meaningful sense, yet begun. They did not know what was in the worn folder on my kitchen table. They did not know that the man who had kept that folder for 20 years had already made the calls he needed to make. That night, in the house on Creston Mill Road, they celebrated as though they had won. The Monday appointment was at 2 in the afternoon, and I arrived at 9 minutes before the hour, which was how I arrived at every appointment that mattered, with enough margin to be composed, but not so early as to appear anxious. Attorney Wallace Okafor was already at his desk when the receptionist showed me in. He had the folder open. He had a second folder beside it, newer, a crisp manila with a label in his own handwriting, and he had his reading glasses on this time rather than pushed to his forehead, which I took as a signal that we were past the introductory phase and into the working one. He did not begin with pleasantries. I respected this. He said, "I want to walk you through what the past week has produced before we discuss the acceptance instrument. There have been developments that bear directly on the scope of what your grandfather's document can accomplish, and I want you to understand the full picture before you sign anything." I sat down. I placed the worn manila folder, the one he had handed me on Thursday, on the edge of his desk in front of me. I placed my notepad beside it, clean page open, pen ready. He said, "I retained a colleague to assist with the financial and documentary analysis. His name is Clement Adeyemi. He is a forensic accountant with a specific background in closely held family business structures and disputed ownership instruments. I have worked with him on several occasions over the past 15 years. He is precise, thorough, and has no prior relationship with any member of your family except through me and through this matter." He paused. What he found in 72 hours of review was more than either of us anticipated. He opened the newer folder. He turned it so it faced me across the desk and set his reading glasses on the surface beside it, because what he was about to say did not require him to read from it. He had committed it. He said it from memory, with the particular fluency of a man who has organized information into a structure so clean it recites itself. The forged management authorization document, the one Derek Calloway had uploaded to the company's shared drive 11 days before the shareholder meeting, was not the first instrument of its kind. It was the third. He let that land. The first had been executed approximately 4 years earlier, an internal amendment to the business operating agreement that had purportedly adjusted the equity distribution among the shareholder class by reallocating a portion of my father's nominal stake to the Operational Management Authority, which was to say, to Renata. The document bore my grandfather's signature, which was impossible because my grandfather had died 18 months before the shareholder meeting, which placed the date of execution comfortably within the period of his life, but which Clement Adeyemi's forensic examination had determined was not consistent with the known signature samples from a 20-year archive of authenticated Gerald Van documents. The signature on the internal amendment had been produced by a method the examiner described in his report as guided overlay transfer, a technique that requires a clean exemplar and a steady hand and produces a result that is visually convincing to a non-specialist and forensically distinguishable at the level of pressure mapping and stroke sequence. The second instrument was more consequential. It was a subordination agreement, executed approximately 2 years after the first, in which the original chain of title on the Garfield Avenue property, the property my grandfather had purchased outright in the early years of the business and which was titled in the name of Van and Strickland, was subordinated to a home equity line of credit instrument that had been opened against the property's appraised value. The home equity line of credit had been opened in the name of Van and Strickland as borrower, with Renata Calloway as the sole authorized signatory, by a lending institution. The credit limit on the instrument was $275,000. As of the date of Clement Adeyemi's review, the outstanding drawn balance was $218,400. The subordination agreement that made this instrument possible bore, in the co-signatory line where a second equity holder's authorization was required under the original business operating agreement, a signature attributed to my father, Thomas Van. Attorney Okafor paused here and looked at me over his desk. I said, "My father did not sign that." He said, "The forensic analysis indicates the signature is not consistent with available authenticated samples from your father. That analysis, if challenged, would require your father's participation in a formal comparison proceeding, which is a conversation you may need to have with him at some point." I noted this. I did not respond to it yet. The third instrument was the management authorization transfer Derek had uploaded, the document I had found in the shared drive, the one with the suspended notary stamp and the guided overlay signature. The forensic examiner had dated the paper stock of the document, a procedure that examines the chemical composition of the paper and its degradation indicators, and had determined that the paper itself was consistent with a manufacture date of no more than 3 years prior, which made a 13-year creation date fraudulent not only in its signature, but in its physical substrate. 3 instruments. A forged equity reallocation. A fraudulent home equity line of credit opened against the Garfield Avenue property, secured in part by a forged co-signature attributed to my father, from which $218,400 had been drawn. And a fabricated management authorization transfer designed to formalize a succession structure that would have made Derek Calloway the effective controlling authority of Van and Strickland upon his mother's retirement, with no recourse available to any other equity holder. I sat with this for a moment. The room was quiet. Outside the window of Suite 407, the city carried on in its indifferent, parallel way. I said, the home equity line. What was the drawn balance used for? Attorney Okafor said, Clement is still completing that portion of the analysis. What he has so far indicates disbursements in multiple tranches, the largest of which, $112,000, moved to a separate operating account at a different institution, one that is not in the company name, in the period between 14 and 20 months ago. $112,000. I thought about the revenue growth I had documented. I thought about the $231,412 in cost reductions over 7 years. I thought about the $3,700 architectural rendering. I thought about how money moved in this business, how the books were kept, who had access to what, and who had been doing the actual work of watching. I said, the account it moved to. Is there a name on it? He said, there is. It is not a company name. He paused. It is a personal account. He said the name. It was Renata Calloway's. Not Van. Not Van and Strickland. Renata Calloway, personal, a separate institution, an account opened in a period that corresponded precisely with the final 18 months of my grandfather's life, when his health had begun to decline and his direct oversight of the business had necessarily reduced. I set my pen down across the notepad. I looked at the window. She had been drawing from a fraudulently secured credit line against a property that was not solely hers to encumber, moving funds to a personal account, during the period when my grandfather was dying and could no longer see clearly what was being done in the name of the business he had built. I did not feel the thing that a person in a dramatic story feels at this point, the surge of heat or the swell of grief-adjacent satisfaction. What I felt was the particular cold clarity of a very large and previously obscured fact coming into full resolution, the way a landscape resolves when a fog burns off, not dramatically but completely. And you see that the terrain was always exactly what it was, you simply had not been able to see all of it until now. Attorney Okafor said, Miss Van, there is one further element. I looked at him. He said, the conditional transfer instrument your grandfather executed with me specifies, as we reviewed, that triggering the transfer also initiates a review of instruments and authorizations executed by the operating management in the 12 months prior to the triggering date. I have determined, in consultation with Clement, that a properly structured triggering of the instrument, combined with a simultaneous filing of the forensic documentation with the appropriate regulatory and potentially prosecutorial bodies, creates a situation in which the fraudulent instruments cannot be unwound or reversed without making the fraud itself materially worse. Every action Renata Calloway takes to defend the instruments becomes, in effect, an additional element of the evidentiary record. He looked at me steadily. This is what your grandfather designed for. He did not design it as a weapon. He designed it as a trap that could only be sprung by the behavior of someone who chose to behave badly. He built it so that an honest person simply standing still and doing nothing could not trigger it. And he built it so that a dishonest person, simply continuing to be what they were, could not avoid it. A reckoning doesn't arrive when you call for it. It arrives when it's ready. I picked up my pen. I said, tell me what I need to sign today and what I should not sign until the evidence compilation is complete. He told me. I signed what he indicated. I left what he indicated and signed. We agreed on a timeline of 10 days for Clement Adeyemi to complete the financial disbursement analysis, and we agreed that I would not communicate anything about the instrument or the forensic findings to any member of the family during that period. I asked him one more question before I left. I said, the source who sent you the documentation. The one watching for a long time. He looked at me. He said, his name is Bernard Strickland. He was your grandfather's business partner for 11 years before the Strickland buyout. He retained a small personal interest in the business's original charter documents as part of the buyout terms, an interest that was never formally extinguished. And that gives him standing as an observer in certain matters related to the business's foundational integrity. He has been watching what has been done to that business for several years. He is 81 years old. He is very clear-minded, and he has been waiting for someone to give what he has seen somewhere useful to go. Bernard Strickland. The Strickland half of the name on the door, 22 years gone from the company, 81 years old, watching from a distance with the patience of a man who understood, as my grandfather had understood, that a reckoning arrives when it is ready. I said, I would like to meet him. Attorney Okafor said, he has already asked to meet you. I drove home from Okafor and Associates in the particular silence that follows the acquisition of information too large to process while in motion. There is a thing that happens in the interval between learning something that will change everything and the moment when you are able to begin acting on it. A kind of held-breath internal state that is neither fear nor excitement, but which partakes of both and belongs to neither, a state of pure suspended readiness. I lived in that state for the first 48 hours after the Monday appointment, going about the ordinary maintenance of my life with the careful precision of someone who cannot afford to be distracted by anything non-essential. The first contact came on Tuesday evening at 6:43. It was a text message from Patricia. It said, Cecily's sweetheart, just checking in on you. I know this has been a hard week. The door is always open if you want to talk. I noted the timestamp. I saved the message to a folder I had created on my phone labeled simply with a letter, the letter F, which stood for nothing that would be legible to anyone who picked up my phone, but which I knew stood for file. I did not respond. The second contact came Wednesday morning at 8:51, a phone call from a number I recognized as the main office line at Garfield Avenue. I did not answer. The voicemail, which I listened to once and then saved in full to a recording app one had downloaded specifically for this period, was from Derek. His tone was the tone he used when he was performing casualness over something that was not casual, the slight over-relaxation of his vowels, the rhythm of someone who has practiced what he is about to say but is trying to make it sound unconsidered. He said, Hey, Cecily, it's Derek. Just calling to, touch base. My mom wanted me to let you know that the consulting firm is going to need some of the vendor documentation from your operational files before the end of the week, so if you can just drop off the notebooks or send over whatever you have, that'd be great. No rush, just when you get a chance. He said it in the voice of someone who fully expected the notebooks to arrive on his desk by Thursday. He called me brother at the end of the message by reflex and then did not. He said anyway, and hung up. I saved the voicemail. I noted the date and time and the specific request for the operational notebooks that contained 7 years of unduplicated institutional knowledge and documentation of my direct contributions to the company's growth. I noted that the request was made verbally, without written authorization or formal legal process, by an individual whose fraudulent upload to the company's shared drive I had documented in my own records. I noted that the request, in context, was not a business request. It was an attempt to complete the erasure. I did not respond. Thursday morning brought a text message from a cousin I had not heard from in 8 months, a peripheral member of the family network. One of the cousins Renata communicated through when she wanted a message delivered with the plausible deniability of family concern rather than direct instruction. The text said, Hey cuz, heard things are rough. You doing okay? I feel like you should just let this thing go, Like, it's just not worth it. I noted the timestamp. I saved the message. I noted the phrase, "let this thing go," and its particular alignment with the desired outcome of the party that had orchestrated the accusation. I saved it to the F folder. Friday produced the call I had been expecting and had prepared for most carefully. Renata called at 11:22 in the morning. She called my cell phone directly, which she had not done in any personal capacity in the better part of 2 years. I answered on the fourth ring. I said, "Hello." She said, in the tone of a person who has considered their opening line with some deliberation, "Cecily, I'm glad you picked up." A pause of approximately 2 seconds. "I know this has been difficult, and I want you to know that I have never taken any of this lightly. Whatever you may believe right now." Another pause. "The audit process is going to take some time, and I think, honestly, the cleanest thing for everyone would be if we could come to an understanding privately. There are ways to handle this that are less damaging for the whole family. I'm sure you can see that." She used the word damaging in a way that was meant to be heard as concern but carried, just beneath its surface, the specific weight of a threat dressed in the vocabulary of reasonableness. I had heard her use this construction many times over 7 years, the implied damage always positioned as something that would befall the family as an undifferentiated whole, so that any resistance to the offered understanding became an act of aggression against everyone rather than a defense against the specific harm she was administering. I said, "I appreciate the call." She waited. A silence of approximately 4 seconds. She said, "Is that all you have to say?" I said, "I think it's better for both of us if I let the process run its course." Another silence. Longer. She said, with a shift in register that was small but definitive, the shift from managed warmth to managed cold, "I hope you're thinking clearly about what that means. For your father's sake, if not your own." I said, "I am thinking very clearly." "Thank you, Renata." I ended the call at 11:26. I opened my recording application. I reviewed the clarity of the audio capture, which was excellent. I saved the file, timestamped it, and moved it to the folder structure I had been building on the encrypted drive. I then opened my notepad to the page where I was keeping a chronological log of all contacts, and I made the entry for 11:22 to 11:26, noted the content summary, noted the specific phrase, "for your father's sake," and noted my own assessment of its intended function, which was leverage, the activation of my father as an instrument of pressure, the suggestion that my intransigence had consequences for him as well as for me. I thought about my father for a moment. I thought about the signature attributed to him on the subordination agreement, the one that had made the $275,000 home equity line of credit possible. I thought about what it meant that his sister had forged his name on a document that exposed him to potential liability in a fraudulent financial instrument without his knowledge. I thought about his hands around his coffee cup and his 2 fingers at his collar, and the decades of silence he had chosen as his primary mode of survival in the family structure Renata had built and maintained. I thought about what Attorney Okafor had said, that at some point I would need to have a conversation with him. I was not ready for that conversation yet. I would be. If you are still with me at this point in this story, I want to stop for just a moment and ask you something directly. Have you ever been in a position where someone had done something genuinely wrong, provably wrong in ways that paperwork could confirm, and you had to sit quietly with that knowledge while they moved through the world with complete confidence, smiling at people, conducting business, receiving the benefit of every doubt, because the mechanism that would expose them was not yet ready? Have you ever held the proof in your hands and had to wait? If you have, you know what that specific kind of patience costs. Drop a word in the comments if this story is connecting with something in your own life. I read every single one. And if someone you know needs to hear that the architecture of a long con can be mapped and that maps lead somewhere, share this with them. We keep going. The calls and messages continued across the 10 days with a rhythm and an escalating texture that I found, in a purely analytical register, instructive. They were instructive about the state of information the other side believed they were operating from, which is to say, they were operating from a model in which I had been successfully neutralized, and the primary remaining task was the retrieval of the operational notebooks and whatever else they imagined I might have, so that the erasure of my contribution to the company's institutional record could be completed. They did not know about the external hard drive. They did not know about the copy shop on Farwell Avenue. They did not know about the worn manila folder in my kitchen cabinet, behind the spice shelf, where no one would look. Derek called again on the following Monday, this time from his personal cell, and the tone had shifted from performed casualness to a register I recognized as his version of pressure, which was a kind of confiding intimacy. The approach of a man who believed that private appeals worked better on women than direct demands. He said, "Look, I'm going to be straight with you. My mom is not trying to destroy you. She's trying to protect the business. And honestly, the faster this gets resolved, the better it is for you too. There's a way out of this that doesn't involve lawyers, and I think you should consider it before it goes somewhere nobody wants it to go." I noted the phrase, "nobody wants it to go." I noted the implicit assumption that a legal process was a destination I feared. I noted the word straight, used by a man who had uploaded a document with a forged signature and a suspended notary stamp to a shared company drive, and then called me to ask for the notebooks. I said, "I'll think about it." He said, "Yeah, okay, good. That's all I'm asking. Just think about it." I said, "Thanks for calling, Derek." He said, "Of course, brother." And caught himself. And said, "You know what I mean." And hung up. I saved it. Patricia called twice more that week. The first call was the emotional maintenance call, the one designed to lower my defenses through warmth and the suggestion that Renata's behavior, while regrettable, was ultimately coming from a place of fear and protectiveness, a reframe that asked me to absorb the damage of a false criminal accusation as the understandable excess of a frightened woman protecting her life's work. I listened to the full call. I said appropriate things at appropriate intervals. I saved the recording. The second call was shorter and contained a piece of information that Patricia almost certainly had not intended to reveal, but did reveal because she was, at her core, an emotional maintenance technician and not a strategist, which meant she occasionally disclosed what the strategy needed her to withhold. She said, in the middle of what was otherwise a general appeal for family reconciliation, and, honestly, I think Renata is planning to move forward with the formal audit filing by the end of next week, so the sooner you and she can come to terms, the less formal and painful this gets. End of next week. I noted the timeline. I noted that she had just told me when the opposition intended to formalize their position. I thanked her for the call. I saved it. The text messages from peripheral family members continued. I saved them all. I did not respond to any of them. The F folder on my phone was becoming substantial. On the Thursday of the second week, a piece of mail arrived at my apartment. It was a letter in a standard business envelope, the return address a firm name I did not recognize immediately. I opened it standing at my kitchen counter. It was a formal written communication on law firm letterhead from an attorney representing Renata Calloway in her capacity as operating manager of Van and Strickland, informing me that in accordance with the terms of my suspension from the company's operational systems, I was required to return all company property currently in my possession, including but not limited to operational records, documentation binders, electronic files, and any copies thereof, within 7 business days or face the possibility of further action. I set the letter on my kitchen counter. I photographed it with my phone, front and back. I photographed the envelope. I noted the date of its arrival and the postmark date. I added these to the log. I set the original letter in the manila envelope with the other physical documents. Then I called Luz. She answered while her sewing machine was running. I could hear the specific rhythm of the machine behind her voice, the steady mechanical pulse of it. I said, "I need you this weekend. Both days if you can." She turned the machine off. She said, "Tell me what we're building." Luz arrived at my apartment on Saturday morning at 9:01, which was 1 minute late by her own standard and which she acknowledged with a brief apology and the immediate production from her canvas bag of a vacuum-sealed package of the specific Ethiopian single-origin coffee she knew I used, and a second package, identical, which was her own, because she was that kind of person. We made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. And we began. I want to describe what the next 2 days looked like in the kind of detail that the task deserves, because what Luz and I built at my kitchen table over that weekend was not simply an organized collection of evidence. It was a forensic architecture, and the craft of it mattered as much as the content, because the credibility of a document presentation is not only what the documents say, but how they are organized, labeled, cross-referenced, and presented. And both of us understood this in different registers that, combined, produced something that neither of us could have built alone. I had the material. 7 years of olive green notebooks, 11 of them, each dated on the spine in my own handwriting and indexed with a table of contents I had written at the opening pages of each volume. I had the external hard drive, with its 3 years of digital documentation, file dated and organized in a folder structure I had built and maintained with the same methodical consistency I had applied to every operational system I had ever touched. I had the manila envelope from the copy shop with the printed documents. I had the letter from Renata's attorney. I had the recording application on my phone with 11 saved audio files, ranging from 45 seconds to 4 minutes and 17 seconds, each labeled by date and the name of the caller. I had the F folder text messages, 23 of them across the 10 days, each saved as a screenshot with the date and time visible in the frame. I had the chronological contact log, 5 pages of handwritten entries on the legal notepad, specific and timed. Luz had something I had not fully anticipated, and which revealed itself across the morning in a way that shifted my understanding of her particular capability. She had, in the years of running her alterations business, developed a client management and contract documentation system that she had built herself from scratch, because the off-the-shelf options had not done what she needed and she had simply built her own. It was a physical-digital hybrid system, part indexed binder, part linked spreadsheet, part cross-reference log, and it was extraordinary. When she looked at my materials and began to organize them, the system she imposed was not mine. It was better than mine. She worked the way she worked at her sewing table, with a specific, quiet, forward-leaning focus that produced no sound except the occasional rustle of paper or the brief click of the label maker she had brought in a small case from her own studio. The same kind of label maker she used on her client fabric samples, a handheld unit that produced clean white tape labels in a 12-point sans serif font, crisp and exact. She labeled every envelope. She labeled every notebook spine with a secondary descriptive label beneath my own date notation, a brief functional descriptor, vendor contract records, event labor documentation, account reconciliation logs, each one accurate and precise. The physical organization we built was this. 3 categories. Category 1. The original business instruments and the forensic analysis. This included my grandfather's conditional transfer instrument from Attorney Okafor's folder, in its own labeled envelope, marked Instrument 1 Original. It included the preliminary written findings from Clement Adeyemi's forensic examination, which Attorney Okafor had given me a copy of at the Monday meeting, in its own envelope, marked Forensic Analysis Preliminary. It included the documented file metadata from the shared drive showing Derek's upload of the fraudulent management authorization transfer, printed at the copy shop, in an envelope marked Digital Evidence, Company Server. Category 2, the operational record. The 11 olive green notebooks in date order, each with its Luz-applied descriptor label, bound together in groups of 3 or 4 with clean white binding straps, then slipped into a long flat archival box I had purchased at a craft supply store the previous week, the kind of box used for oversized documents, cream-colored, with a lid, with a label on the spine that said Van and Strickland Operational Records, years 1 through 7. Inside the box's front cover, Luz had taped a single index sheet listing every notebook's date range, primary content category, and relevant page references for the 3 forensic callback items. Category 3. The communication evidence. The audio recordings, transferred from my phone to the external hard drive the previous Thursday and also burned to a disk, the kind of physical backup that cannot be altered without visible trace. Labeled in Luz's handwriting on the disk face with a fine-tipped marker, audio log, dates 1 through 10 of contact period. The screenshot printouts of the 23 text messages, organized chronologically and cross-referenced against the written contact log. The contact log itself, the 5 pages of legal notepad entries, which Luz had photographed and also typed into a clean document on her laptop, formatted with date, time, caller, method, content summary, and a field she had added herself called strategic significance, in which she had written, for each entry, a one-line assessment of what the communication revealed about the sender's knowledge state and intentions. Her assessments were so precise that I read them a second time simply for the satisfaction of seeing that another person had understood, independently and completely, exactly what each contact had been trying to accomplish. The communication evidence went into a second archival box, same cream stock, with the label, Contact Record, Suspension Period. Luz also produced, from the canvas bag that had arrived with the coffee, 3 items I had not known she was bringing. The first was a sheet of sequentially numbered tamper-evident stickers, the kind used by legal service firms to seal envelopes that are part of an official record. She had ordered them from a professional legal supply vendor. She peeled them carefully and sealed the flap of every manila envelope in both archival boxes, pressing each sticker across the seam with her thumbnail, then writing the date and her initials over the sticker's face in the fine-tipped marker. She said, without looking up from this task, anything you submit needs to look like it has been handled with the care of someone who understood from the beginning that it would be examined by professionals. Because you did understand that. From the beginning. The second item was a tracking log. A physical ledger, a small one, the kind used for inventory, with columns for item description, date sealed, sealed by, chain of custody notes, and a destination field. She had pre-labeled the column headers in her own handwriting. We filled it out together, going through both boxes item by item, one of us reading the description aloud and the other writing. When we finished, she photographed every page of the completed ledger with her phone, emailed the photographs to herself and to me from her business email, which generated a time-stamped record, and then placed the original ledger in the front pocket of the first archival box. The third item was something she set on the table between us at the end of Saturday, when the physical organization was complete and we were on our 3rd cups of coffee and the apartment had the particular texture of a space where serious work has been done, a certain changed quality in the air. It was a small folded note, handwritten, on the thick cream paper she used for correspondence with her tailoring clients. She said, "I wrote this 2 nights ago. I wasn't sure whether to bring it." She pushed it across the table. I unfolded it. It was a timeline. A personal timeline, in her precise handwriting, covering the period from the evening of the dinner at Patricia's house, 3 weeks before the shareholder meeting, forward through the day she had accompanied me to Attorney Okafor's office. It documented what she had personally witnessed, what she had personally heard, what she had personally been included on. It was written in the first person with a specificity and a clarity that was not the casual reconstruction of memory, but the organized record of a careful witness who had been keeping notes. At the bottom of the last page, she had written, "I am prepared to attest to the accuracy of this account in any appropriate proceeding." I looked at that last line for a long time. I said, "When did you start keeping notes?" She said, "The night of Patricia's dinner." She said it in the same tone she had used to tell me her business grossed $208,000 the previous year, simply, without emphasis, as a fact that did not require amplification. I knew that night that something was going to happen. I have known Renata Calloway my whole life, and I know what she looks like when she has decided on something. I didn't know what I was going to do with what I was writing down. I just knew that you would eventually need someone who had been paying attention from the beginning. I set her written account on the table. I looked at her for a moment in the early evening light of my kitchen. This woman the family had written off as a deficient ambition, running an alteration shop, outside the family's circle of consequence, unremarkable by every metric Renata used to measure people. I started working for Van and Strickland at 23, the summer after I finished my hospitality management degree from a state university, whose name my aunt had a habit of never quite finishing when she mentioned it in front of clients. A small cruelty she deployed so smoothly that it took me 2 years to identify it as deliberate. She would say, "Cecily went to school up at," and then pivot before the name landed, moving directly to whatever she wanted to talk about next, so that the sentence existed only to remind the room I hadn't gone somewhere worth finishing. That was her primary verbal architecture, the incomplete sentence as a weapon. She never said the damaging thing directly. She positioned the air around it and let other people fill in the space. Renata Van, by then Renata Calloway, through a marriage that had produced one son and an eventual, highly managed separation, was 54 when I started working there and looked precisely as a woman who has spent decades curating her appearance looks. Deliberate, upholstered, controlled. She wore her silver hair in a chignon that she never varied. She owned 7 versions of the same charcoal blazer in slightly different fabrics, and she rotated them with a regularity that I came to understand was intentional, a costuming choice that communicated consistency, solidity. The impression that she was a fixed point in a turning world. She ran the business the way she ran the family, through selective information, through the careful distribution of approval, and through the maintenance of a social architecture in which everyone understood, without being told directly, that her goodwill was the only currency that held its value. Her son, my cousin Derek Calloway, was 28 when I joined the company and had the particular quality of a person who has been told he is exceptional by someone who needed him to believe it. He had a habit of repeating other people's ideas back in meetings with minor rephrasings, with a timing and confidence that made the repetition read as origination. He had been given the title of operations coordinator at 25 without any discernible operational training, and he had learned early that the most efficient way to protect his position was not to perform it, but to surveil it. To know what others were doing well enough to take credit for the successful parts and sufficient distance from the rest. He called everyone brother regardless of gender or relation, a verbal tic that was intended to read as warmth but functioned as erasure, a way of making everyone interchangeable, no one specific. Brother. Everyone was just brother to Derek. My father, Thomas Van, the third of Gerald's 4 children, occupied the particular region of the family that I can only describe as the DMZ between acknowledgement and irrelevance. He had never wanted to work in the business. He was a quiet, indoor man who preferred his workshop and his woodworking and the specific silence that comes with doing something with your hands that requires no negotiation with other people. He had a small equity stake in Van and Strickland by virtue of his birth and his father's insistence, and he attended the quarterly family shareholder meetings the way some people attend dental appointments, with a practiced blankness and a clear intention to leave as quickly as possible. He did not fight with his sister. He did not, in my experience, fight with anyone. He nodded at her decisions. He did not ask questions. He had a habit, when a conversation made him uncomfortable, of touching the collar of his shirt with 2 fingers, a brief adjustment of a collar that was already straight. A gesture so consistent and involuntary that I had catalogued it in my memory by the time I was 12 years old. It meant, I know this is wrong, and I am not going to say so. He loved me, I believe, in the way that passive men love their children, completely and uselessly. There was also my aunt's younger sister, my Aunt Patricia, who is not relevant to the main machinery of what happened, but is relevant to the texture of it, because she was the one the family sent to deliver the softer blows, the ones that required a certain warmth to land correctly. Patricia had never had a conflict with anyone in her life, not because she was without grievance, but because she had long ago discovered that a well-timed embrace and a murmured, "You know how Renata is," could defuse nearly any situation while ensuring the situation remained unresolved. She was the family's emotional maintenance technician. She kept the temperature manageable. She was the one who called me 3 days after the conference room morning to say she was so sorry about all of this, and that she was sure it would all sort itself out, which I understood to be Renata's soft message that I should go quietly. I did not go quietly. But I did go. I said, "You have been doing this the whole time." She said, "You have been doing this the whole time too." She picked up her coffee cup. We just both had different materials. We worked through Sunday as well. Sunday was the digital organization, the backup architecture, the redundancy structure. 2 encrypted drives, one for me, one entrusted to attorney Okafor's firm for secure holding. A cloud backup with two-factor authentication, logged and documented in the tracking ledger. A complete print set of the digital evidence, sealed, logged, held at my apartment. We finished at 6:44 in the evening. The 2 archival boxes sat on my kitchen table, sealed and labeled, the tamper-evident stickers intact, the tracking ledger complete, the chain of custody documented from first creation to current location. Luz stood and stretched and looked at the boxes with the expression of a craftsperson looking at finished work. She said, "This is as clean as anything I have ever seen." I said, "It needs to be." She said, "It is." She left at 7:03. I stood at my kitchen table alone with the boxes and my grandfather's watch on my wrist and thought about the word that attorney Okafor had used on Thursday afternoon when I had asked him about the timeline for the next step after the evidence submission. After the formal acceptance instrument was fully executed, after Clement Adeyemi's complete financial disbursement analysis had been delivered and incorporated. The word he had used was event. He had said, "The timing of the event matters." There is one gathering in the business calendar in the next 30 days that I believe represents the optimal context for the administrative filings to become known. He had said it with the restrained precision of a man who had spent decades watching things arrive when they were ready. He had meant the annual family holiday event. The one the business hosted every December for its major client accounts, the vendors, the family members, the community partners, the extended network of the company's professional relationships. An event that Renata had grown over the years into a significant social occasion, one at which she was, without question, the central figure, the host, the face of the business and the family, the woman at the center of the room. The event was in 11 days. On the evening before it, across the city, Renata Calloway was putting the final details of her holiday table arrangement in order, certain of her position, certain of the completion of her work. Sending text messages to Derek about the catering order for the client dinner while wearing the Miami bracelet on her wrist and the wide-faced gold watch that she kept for important evenings, with no reason in the world to suspect that the document that would end her authority was already executed. Already filed with a secondary holding agent, already processed in the administrative framework of the business registration system, waiting only for the moment of its formal delivery, which had been scheduled for 9 in the morning, 2 hours before the event's first guests were expected to arrive. She had planned a beautiful party. She had no idea she was planning it for me. The morning of the annual holiday event arrived with the particular stillness of a day that has been a long time coming. I was awake at 5:41, not from anxiety, but from the internal precision of a person whose body has registered that today is not an ordinary day and has adjusted accordingly. I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table. The 2 archival boxes were no longer there. They had been transferred to attorney Okafor's office on Monday, the full evidence package logged and received, the tracking ledger entry signed and dated by the firm's receptionist as a chain of custody confirmation. What remained at my kitchen table was my grandfather's watch, which I had set in front of me the night before, and a single sheet of paper, my own handwritten summary of the morning sequence, the order of events as attorney Okafor, and I had planned them in our final meeting 3 days prior. At 9 in the morning, Clement Adeyemi would deliver the completed forensic financial analysis to the firm. I had reviewed the preliminary version. The final version, which incorporated the full disbursement tracing on the home equity line of credit, contained 3 additional findings that extended the documented diversion from $218,400 to $261,822 across a period of 26 months, through 4 separate receiving accounts, 2 of which had been closed in the weeks immediately following my grandfather's death. A timing that the forensic analysis described, in the careful language of professional documentation, as consistent with an effort to reduce the visible financial footprint of the disbursements during the period of estate proceedings. $261,822. Drawn from a credit instrument secured in part by a forged cosignature. Across 26 months. Beginning in the final year of my grandfather's life. At 9:30, Attorney Okafor would file the formal acceptance instrument with the State Business Registration Office, which would initiate the administrative transfer process. The filing was not a public event. It was a bureaucratic one. It would generate a confirmation number and a processing timestamp and would begin the 48-hour clock that the attorney had described at our first meeting. But there was a secondary element that I had not fully understood until our final meeting 3 days prior, an element that Attorney Okafor had explained with the same patient thoroughness he brought to everything. The conditional transfer instrument, in its triggering, also activated an automatic notification protocol that my grandfather had written into the document's administrative structure with considerable specificity. The protocol required that formal written notice of the transfer be delivered to the current operating management of Van and Strickland, which is to say, to Renata Calloway, within 4 hours of the administrative filing. The delivery had to be made in person, by a representative of the attorney's office, with a signed receipt. Attorney Okafor had arranged for this delivery to occur at 10:30 in the morning at the Garfield Avenue location, where the event was being set up and where Renata would be present and supervising, as she always was in the hours before a major company event, running her pre-event checklist with the focused authority of a woman entirely confident in her domain. The event itself was scheduled to begin at noon. I arrived at the Garfield Avenue location at 11:40. I want to describe what I was wearing, because it matters to the record of this morning in a way that is not vanity but precision. I was wearing a dress I had purchased 3 weeks earlier, a deep burgundy wool crepe, simple in line, with a modest neckline and long sleeves and a fit that was composed without being constructed. I had not worn a dress to a company function in 7 years. I had worn dark trousers and neutral blouses and the wardrobe of a person who had chosen not to compete. This was a different choice. I wore my grandfather's watch. I wore the small gold stud earrings I had owned since my mid-20s. I had done my hair the way I wore it when I wanted to feel like myself rather than like a function, loose, with a few strands at the sides of my face. The chestnut color catching the December light in the parking lot as I walked toward the main entrance of the building I had worked in for 7 years. I carried a single tote bag. In it were 3 items. The brown notebook from my desk drawer at home, with my grandfather's line written inside the cover. A clean printed copy of the evidence summary that Attorney Okafor had prepared, a 6-page document, organized and precise, designed to be comprehensible to a non-specialist audience. And the worn manila folder. The original. All 12 pages of my grandfather's conditional transfer instrument, which Attorney Okafor had returned to me at our final meeting because he believed, and I agreed, that I should be the one carrying it when I walked into that room. The event was in the main reception hall of the Garfield Avenue building, which was the largest space the property contained and the one Renata reserved for the highest status occasions. She had decorated it with the considered precision of a woman who understood that a room's appearance communicated authority, long tables with cream linens, floral arrangements in deep green and white, the company's logo on a tasteful backdrop near the entrance, catered food arranged on warming stations by staff I had trained. It was a beautiful room. She had built it well. I had helped her build it over many years, without credit, and I could see, as I entered, the specific touches in the logistics and flow of the space, the placement of the reception table, the traffic pattern between the food stations and the seating area, the positioning of the bar service relative to the entrance, touches that bore the operational signature of decisions I had made or recommended across multiple event cycles, decisions that had become standard practice without my name attached to them. There were perhaps 40 people already present when I arrived, a mixture of major client contacts, vendor partners, and family members. The room had the warm, slightly elevated energy of a professional holiday event in its early stage, people finding their drinks and their conversations, the room not yet at its full social temperature. I accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server, held it, and moved into the room with the composure of someone who belonged there, because I did belong there, which was a fact I no longer needed anyone in that room to confirm for me. I saw Renata before she saw me. She was near the far end of the main table, in a black blazer I had not seen before, not her charcoal rotation, a statement piece, structured and expensive-looking, with her silver chignon precise and her gold watch on her wrist, the important evening's watch. The champagne dial wide-faced one, and I could see, even from across the room, that she was not wearing the Miami bracelet. She had not worn it publicly since the morning of the shareholder meeting, which I had noted without comment. She was speaking with two clients I recognized from the corporate account portfolio, a man and a woman from a regional financial services firm that represented one of the company's 3 largest annual contracts. She had the particular quality she always carried in these settings, the contained authority of a hostess who has arranged everything and knows it, the specific confidence of a woman in full command of her room. Derek was near the bar, in another suit, a darker one this time, charcoal rather than medium blue, and his lapel pin was different today, larger, more visible, the performance of occasion. He was talking to a younger vendor contact and clicking his pen, click, pause, click, the rhythm of a man at ease. Patricia was near the entrance, with a small group of extended family, performing the social lubrication function she had always performed, moving warmth through the room like a current, ensuring the temperature stayed manageable. She saw me when I was approximately 12 feet inside the door. Her expression shifted, a fractional compression around the eyes that was there and gone, a microsecond of recalculation identical in its structure and its brevity to the one I had seen in Renata's face during the shareholder meeting. My father was not there yet. He arrived 11 minutes later, at 11:51, in his plaid-collared shirt and dark pants, with the careful blankness of a man attending a dental appointment. He took a drink from the bar. He stood near the edge of the room. At 11:53, I saw Attorney Okafor enter. He was with Clement Adeyemi, whom I was meeting in person for the first time, a trim man in his mid-50s with the quiet, economical presence of someone who has spent a career making documents speak for themselves. Behind them was Luz, in a dress I had never seen her wear, a structured deep green that I recognized as her own design, because I had seen the fabric folded on her cutting table 2 weeks earlier and had not put it together until this moment. She had made it for today. She had made it the way she made everything, with the quiet excellence of someone who would never announce what they were doing, but who would do it completely. And behind Luz was a man I had not met in person but whose description matched the image I had formed, Bernard Strickland, 81 years old, with the upright bearing of a man who was raised to stand straight and had never stopped, in a dark navy suit and a tie. His white hair close-cropped, his expression the composed and patient expression of a man who has been waiting a long time for a specific moment and has arrived at it without hurry. He looked around the room he had helped found, decades earlier, whose door still carried half his name. He looked at it with the quiet ownership of someone who has never needed to claim what was always his to claim. He looked across the room and found me before I could find him, and he nodded once, with the same economy my grandfather had always brought to significant acknowledgments, a single, deliberate, complete nod. I nodded back. At 11:58, Renata saw me. I was standing in the center of the room, near the main table, in the burgundy dress with the tote bag at my shoulder. And when she registered that I was there, the room seemed to organize itself around her recognition the way rooms do when the central gravity of a space has been suddenly redirected. I saw her excuse herself from the financial services clients with the smooth brevity of long practice and begin to move toward me, and I saw Derek track her movement from the bar and begin to move as well, a convergence. The two of them approaching from slightly different angles, the geometry of people who had coordinated in advance. She reached me first. Her expression was the controlled cold she had deployed on the phone call, the register beneath the managed warmth, and she did not bother with the warmth this time. She looked at me in the burgundy dress and the watch and the loose chestnut hair and said, with a quietness that was designed to contain the exchange within our immediate radius, "I'm not sure what you think you're doing here, but this is a company event, and you are no longer a representative of this company." She paused. "I would ask you to leave before this becomes uncomfortable for everyone." Derek arrived at her shoulder. He said, "Yeah, Cecily, this really isn't the place." He said it in the confiding tone, the private appeal, brother without the word. Let's not do this here. I did not look away from Renata. I did not lower my voice. I said, at the same volume I would have used to address a client, a conversational volume, perfectly legible to the people in our immediate vicinity, which included, I was aware, the financial services clients she had just left, and 2 vendor partners and my father, who had moved, in the 11 minutes since his arrival, to a position approximately 8 feet away, near a window, with his drink in both hands, watching. I said, I am here as a representative of this company. I have been a representative of this company since I was 23 years old. And I have something the room should hear. She said, with a smile that stopped at the cheekbones, blood or not, a thief is a thief. She said it in the same register as the conference room morning, with the same performed measurement, the same geometric smile. She said it because she believed it was still a weapon. She did not yet understand that she had just handed me the moment I needed, in front of 40 people, on the record. I did not flinch. I reached into the tote bag and removed the 6-page evidence summary. I set it on the table beside me, face up, with the quiet deliberation of someone who has rehearsed nothing because nothing requires rehearsal when you are simply showing people the truth. I pressed my left thumbnail into my right palm, once, at the center of it, and felt the brief pressure of that small private anchor, and I observed, in the 2 seconds before I spoke, the specific quality of Renata's confidence, its texture, the way it was built from the accumulated weight of decades of unchallenged authority, and I saw, for the first time, how thin that foundation actually was, how entirely it depended on no one ever knowing what I now knew. I said, 11 years ago, my grandfather sat with his personal attorney and drafted a document that gave me controlling interest of the original family holdings on one condition, that the operating management had acted in bad faith against a direct descendant. I paused. That document was filed with the State Business Registration Office at 9:31 this morning. The administrative transfer is in process. As of 48 hours from this morning, the signatory authority on every account, every property title, and every registered business interest of Van and Strickland transfers to me. The room had changed. It had not gone silent in the dramatic sense. People were still moving, still holding their drinks. But the social temperature had shifted in the way it shifts when something with real gravity enters a space, and the people nearest to it begin to feel the pull without yet fully understanding its source. Renata said, that is not a real document. She said it with the conviction of a person who has not yet processed that conviction is different from fact. Whatever Wallace Okafor has told you, he is an old man with a personal grievance and no legal standing in the affairs of this business. I said, he is the attorney who represented Gerald Van for 31 years, and the document he holds is notarized, witnessed, and has been reviewed by a forensic documents specialist. It is legally airtight. I turned to the table, to the evidence summary. And it is not the only document that has been reviewed. I turned to the first section of the summary, and I spoke the way I had spoken in 7 years of negotiating vendor contracts and managing client relationships and doing the operational work of a business that would have listed without me, which is to say clearly, precisely, without theater. I said, approximately 4 years ago, an internal amendment to the business operating agreement was filed, purporting to reallocate equity from other shareholders to the operating management authority. The signature attributed to my grandfather on that document has been determined by forensic analysis to be inconsistent with authenticated samples from a 20-year archive. It is a forgery. Derek's pen stopped clicking. I said, approximately 2 years ago, a home equity line of credit was opened against the Garfield Avenue property in the name of Van and Strickland, with a credit limit of $275,000. The co-signatory authorization required by the business operating agreement was attributed to Thomas Van. I looked at my father when I said his name. He was very still. Both hands on his drink, eyes on me. That signature has also been determined to be forensically inconsistent with authenticated samples. My father did not sign that document. Patricia said, from somewhere behind my left shoulder, Cecily, sweetheart, in the tone of managed warmth and finality, and I turned to face her directly and said, with the same steady conversational register, "I would ask you to let me finish." And she did not speak again. I said, "The drawn balance on that home equity line of credit was $261,822, disbursed across 26 months through 4 receiving accounts, 2 of which were closed in the weeks following Gerald Van's death. The forensic financial analysis documenting this disbursement chain was completed this morning by Clement Adeyemi." I indicated him across the room, where he stood with the documents, a forensic accountant retained by Attorney Okafor. "Mr. Adeyemi is available to answer questions about his methodology." Renata said, "This is ridiculous." But the word ridiculous came out at a slightly higher register than her usual controlled cadence, a half step above her habitual frequency, and I heard it the way you hear a structural sound in a building, a shift that tells you something is moving that was previously fixed. I said, 11 days before the shareholder meeting at which I was publicly accused of theft, a management authorization transfer document was uploaded to the company's shared drive under Derek Calloway's user credentials. I did not look at Derek when I said this. I looked at the financial services clients who were standing 4 feet away, the corporate account couple who represented one of the company's 3 largest annual contracts, because they had been in this company's orbit for years, and they deserved to know what had been done in the name of the business they had trusted. That document purported to be 13 years old. The paper stock has been forensically dated to a manufacture date of no more than 3 years prior. The notarization stamp belongs to a notary whose license was suspended 8 years ago. And the signature attributed to my grandfather is, again, forensically inconsistent with his known authenticated samples. I paused. I looked at Renata. I said, 3 forged documents. 1 fraudulent credit instrument. $261,822 in unauthorized disbursements. A false accusation of theft directed at me, publicly, in front of this company's stakeholders, designed to remove the one person in this organization whose institutional knowledge made the books readable enough to reveal what had been done. I reached into the tote bag and removed the worn manila folder. I set it on the table beside the evidence summary. I said, my grandfather knew who he was leaving this business with. He prepared accordingly. He also knew who he was watching. He prepared for that too. I set my right hand flat on the worn manila folder, on the soft edges of it, on the material that had been in a drawer in a 4th-floor office for 20 years, holding its ground, waiting for the moment it was ready. I said, the accusation against me was false. The documents that were used to consolidate authority in this business were forged. The money that was drawn from a fraudulent instrument has been forensically traced. All of this is documented, organized, and is currently with the appropriate authorities for their review. A pause. A single breath. I am not asking this room for anything. I am showing this room what is true. What happens next is not my decision. It is the consequence of decisions that were made a long time ago by other people. I picked up the evidence summary. I picked up the worn manila folder. I placed them back in my tote bag. I straightened, and I looked at Renata Calloway one final time across the cream-linene table of the event she had built, in the room whose logistics bore the invisible signature of 7 years of my work, and I said the only thing left to say. I said I kept very good records. Renata's mouth opened. It closed. She turned to Derek, a movement so sharp it was almost involuntary, and Derek was looking at the floor with the chrome ballpoint pen held still in his hand, not clicking, not noting, simply still. A man whose performed competence had just encountered the specific, flattening weight of documented fact and had found, in that encounter, that there was nothing underneath the performance to hold it up. He said, "Mom." Just that. Just the word. Patricia was not performing anything. She was looking at her hands. Bernard Strickland had moved, at some point during my delivery, to a position near the entrance of the room, near the door that still bore his name in the company's founding record, and he was standing with his hands clasped in front of him, watching the room with the patient attention of a man who has been waiting for a specific accounting for a very long time and is receiving it now without surprise, only with the deep, settled satisfaction of a debt coming finally, correctly, due. Attorney Wallace Okafor, behind me and to my right, said nothing. He did not need to. He had done his work. It was in the folder. It was in the filing. It was in the 48-hour clock that was already running. Luz was standing beside me when I turned away from the table. She had moved to my shoulder at some point during the delivery, quietly, without announcement, the way she did everything, present and competent and there. The 48 hours that followed the event were not dramatic in the way that the word 48 hours suggests when it follows a confrontation. They were administrative. This is the nature of genuine legal and financial consequence. It does not arrive with theater. It arrives with paperwork. The administrative transfer of signatory authority was processed and confirmed at 11:14 in the morning, 2 days after the filing on a Thursday. When I received a notification email from the state business registration system and forwarded it to Attorney Okafor, who forwarded it to the financial institution holding the fraudulent home equity line of credit, who placed the account under administrative review within 4 hours of receiving the notification. The Garfield Avenue property, whose title chain was now under forensic review as part of the fraud assessment, was flagged in the lending institution system as encumbered by a disputed instrument, which initiated an automatic review process that temporarily froze the property against any further transactions. Renata Calloway's signatory authority on every Van and Strickland account was administratively suspended. The 3 business bank accounts she had held sole signing authority over were transferred to administrative hold pending the completion of the review. Derek Calloway's operations coordinator title, which had existed by virtue of an internal authorization that traced back to the same forged operating agreement amendment that had been submitted to forensic review, was no longer recognized in any official company document as of the date of the transfer confirmation. These were not punishments I administered. They were structural consequences. They were the natural downstream result of the documents being what they were and of the institutions that held those documents doing what institutions do when presented with evidence of fraud. They follow their own procedures. My grandfather had understood this. He had built the instrument so that the consequences were built into the architecture, so that they could not be accelerated by my anger or softened by my mercy, because they did not depend on either. They were simply what happened when the reckoning arrived. The law firm that had sent the letter to my apartment, the one demanding the return of company property within 7 business days, withdrew the communication on the 4th day after the event, in a brief written notice that cited a need to reassess the current state of the matter. I filed the withdrawal notice in the F folder with the same timestamp protocol Luz had taught me, behind the original letter and its photographic copies. Renata called on the 2nd day after the event. I did not answer. She left a voicemail in which the managed warmth was entirely gone, and in its place was something I had not heard from her before, a quality in the voice that was neither cold nor controlled, but which was, unmistakably, frightened. She said she wanted to talk. She said there had been misunderstandings. She used the phrase, for the family's sake, the same structural architecture as for your father's sake, the same mechanism, the same appeal to a collective I was supposed to feel responsible for. She said, you know, I have always had great respect for what you contributed. I noted that she said had in past tense. I saved the voicemail. I did not call back. Derek texted on the 3rd day. He did not use the word brother. He said, I think we need to talk like adults. There's a way through this that works for everyone. I noted the phrase, like adults, its specific implication that my current behavior was the behavior of a person who was not behaving like an adult. I saved the message. I did not respond. Patricia came to my apartment on the 4th day. She knocked. I could hear her on the other side of the door, the particular quality of her presence, the soft-soled shoes, and the careful phrasing of her knock. She said, through the door, Cecily. Sweetheart. I know you're there. I just want 5 minutes. She waited. I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee and my grandfather's watch on my wrist, and I said nothing. After approximately 4 minutes, I heard her footsteps move away down the hall. I noted the time. I did not add it to any official file. Some things are simply what they are. My father called on the 5th day. He did not leave a voicemail. He called again on the 6th day. On the 7th day, He called at 8 in the evening and I answered. He said, Cecily. Just my name, in the way Luz had said it in Attorney Okafor's office. The way that means the thing that does not have a shorter form. I said, Dad. A silence. Long enough to contain several things that neither of us said. He said, I didn't know about the signature. His voice had the quality of someone who has been carrying a specific weight for several days and has decided, at the end of the 7th day, to set it down, not with drama, not with confession, but simply by saying the true thing in the simplest possible words. I want you to know that. I said, I know. Another silence. He said, I should have said something. A long time ago. About a lot of things. The two-finger collar touch was not visible to me on a phone call, but I knew it was happening. I knew its precise quality, the length of this particular touch, which was longer than adjustment and closer to holding on. I don't expect you to, I don't know. I just wanted you to hear it. I said, I hear it. We were both quiet for a moment. He said, your grandfather. He always said you were the one who was paying attention. A pause. He was right about that. I said, he was right about most things. And then, after a moment, are you all right? He said, I'll figure it out. In the way that my father said things he meant. Plain and without flourish and entirely reliable in its own limited way. I'll figure it out. We did not speak for long after that. We did not need to. The door between us was not open. It was not closed. It was ajar in the specific way of things that have been damaged without being destroyed, and I left it that way, because I am not in the business of slamming doors that deserve to remain partly open, and because my grandfather had taught me, through his own example, the difference between a reckoning and a destruction, and I did not want the second thing even when I had earned the right to it. The formal referral of the forensic evidence to the appropriate state business fraud and financial crimes authority was made by Attorney Okafor on the 10th day after the event. He notified me by letter, the formal kind, on firm letterhead, delivered to my apartment with a tracking number. He enclosed a copy of the referral notice and a one-paragraph personal note, handwritten on the firm's cream stationery, which said, Gerald would have been very pleased with the way you handled this. Not only with what you did, but with how you did it. He spoke of you exactly as you have turned out to be. I am honored to have carried this for him, and for you. I folded the note and placed it in the brown notebook, behind the inside cover, beside my grandfather's line. The extent of the fraud investigation is ongoing as of this account's telling, and I will not speak to its ultimate conclusions here, because some things are properly in the custody of institutions and processes, and are not mine to narrate in advance of their resolution. What I will tell you is that $261,822 has a weight in a fraud investigation that is not metaphorical. It is a number that places a matter in a category of seriousness that generates its own procedural gravity. And that the home equity line of credit, now in administrative review, has triggered a review of the underlying property title, which has its own procedural timeline and its own set of consequences that did not require my direction or my anger to arrive at. I hired 3 people in the first 30 days of managing Van and Strickland under my operational authority. One was a bookkeeper with forensic accounting experience, recommended by Clement Adeyemi, to conduct a full audit of the company's financial records. One was an operations manager with a hospitality background to manage day-to-day function while the company stabilized. And one was Luz Ferreira, in a formal capacity as a contract event styling and client relations consultant, at a rate she named and I accepted without negotiation, because she had been qualified for the role for years, and the only thing that had ever stood between her and it was a woman who had needed the family's perception of Luz to remain small. Luz had her own clients and her own business and her studio and her precise, original sewing machine, and she made clear that the consulting arrangement was a complement to these things, not a replacement for them. I told her that was fine. She told me she knew it was fine. We had coffee. Several months have passed. I am sitting at a small table near the window of the office I now use, the one on the upper floor of the Garfield Avenue building, the one that was Renata's for the years I worked here and that has been, in the months since the transfer, reimagined in a way that is quieter and more functional and that contains, on the windowsill, A ceramic mug of the Ethiopian single-origin coffee that I buy in vacuum-sealed packages now because it is the coffee I always wanted and there was never a reason, beyond the inertia of not choosing it, to have anything else. Outside the window, the city is doing what cities do in early spring, which is present a landscape in the process of becoming itself, not yet fully transformed but unmistakably in motion. The trees along the street below coming into leaf with the particular green of new growth that does not last long and is beautiful specifically because of that impermanence. The sky is the pale, clear blue of a morning that has not yet decided what it will be. My grandfather's watch is on my wrist. I have worn it every day since the shareholder meeting, through the 10 days of documentation and the event and the 48-hour clock and the months of operational work that have followed. And it keeps time with the same accuracy the watchmaker on Clement Street promised it would, the movement clean, the cream face unmarked, the brass bezel warm against my wrist from the body heat of all the days I have carried it since he wore it for 30 years before me. It is the physical center of the story I have just told you, the object that connects me, in a direct and unbroken line, to a man who built a door in a drawer in a law office and trusted me, across the decades, to still be standing when I needed it. I have been thinking, in these quieter months, about what the pattern of this particular experience actually teaches, because I am constitutionally unable to have an experience without eventually organizing it into something I can use. And because I believe the things I have learned are not personal to me but are structural and transferable and belong to anyone who has sat in a version of that conference room and heard a version of that sentence and understood, in the stillness that followed it, that they were dealing with something that required a response that was not noise. The first thing. Competence without documentation is a gift you give your enemies. I spent 7 years being the person who fixed everything and being the person who was credited for nothing, and I told myself that the work was self-evident and that eventually the value would speak for itself. It does not work that way. The work speaks for itself only if you have built it a record. The olive green notebooks were not a response to what Renata did to me. They were a habit I had developed because my grandfather taught me that documentation was a form of respect for your own effort. But they became, in the end, the physical architecture of my defense, the evidence that what I said I had done was something I had actually done, traceable and dated and indexed. Whatever you are building right now, wherever you are, keep the record. Not because you're expecting to need it. Because you deserve to have your work witnessed, even if the only witness is you. The second thing. Silence is not concession. I said almost nothing for 10 days while my family sent messages and made calls and constructed a narrative in which I had been neutralized, and the primary remaining task was the retrieval of what I held. My silence was interpreted, by everyone who was not inside it, as the silence of a person who had accepted defeat. Silence from a position of documented strength is the most powerful strategic posture I know of, and I say this as someone who spent years confusing the absence of conflict with the absence of leverage. They are not the same thing. You do not have to announce what you are holding. The weight of it will become apparent in due time. The third thing. The people who forge things are always afraid of the people who file things. Every fraudulent instrument that Renata and Derek constructed was constructed in response to a fear, the fear of what would happen if the equity structure were examined, if my grandfather's actual intentions became visible, if the institutional knowledge I held were properly valued. The fraud was not aggression from a position of strength. It was construction from a position of fear. And fear-based construction always has the same flaw. It is built to deceive, not to endure, which means that the moment someone stops being deceived, the structure has no remaining function. What looks like power when it is built from concealment is only ever borrowed time. The fourth thing. Not everyone who stands beside you is visible. Luz Ferreira was invisible to the family that dismissed her, running an alteration studio in a commercial strip, unremarkable by every metric they used to measure worth. Bernard Strickland was 22 years gone from the company and 81 years old, watching from a distance with the careful patience of someone who had never stopped caring about the integrity of the thing he had helped build. Attorney Wallace Okafor had been holding a folder in a drawer for 2 decades because a man he respected had asked him to, None of these people were the people the family was watching. That is exactly why they were able to do what they did. The people who will actually stand beside you when it matters are almost never the people who announce it in advance. They're the ones who show up quietly, with the right materials, at the moment the work needs to happen. The fifth thing. A reckoning does not require your anger to function. I want to say this carefully, because I think it is the thing most easily misunderstood about the story I have just told you. I was not dispassionate. There were nights in those 10 days, and in the months before them, when I felt things that I will not characterize as anything less than the full weight of 7 years of effort treated as theft and 7 years of contribution treated as evidence of ingratitude. I felt it. I did not act from it. My grandfather's instrument was not built by anger. It was built by precision, by the long, patient, methodical application of clarity to a situation that he understood was going to require exactly that clarity to resolve correctly. His reckoning arrived not because he pursued it, but because he prepared for it and then trusted it to arrive when the conditions were right. My job was to still be standing when it got there. That was the whole job. And I was. If this story gave you something, I want you to give it somewhere. Share it with the person in your life who is in the middle of the quiet part, the part before the reckoning, the part where they are holding the notebooks and the documentation and the patient knowledge that the work they have done is real. And who needs to hear that still being standing is enough? That the door your grandfather builds in a drawer 20 years before you need it is built on the faith that you will be the kind of person who walks through it with your integrity intact. Be that person. That is the whole instruction. Keep your boundaries strong. Guard your peace, and I will see you in the next. I left the office on Garfield Avenue at 4:37 in the afternoon on the day of the conference room meeting. I walked to my car. I sat in the driver's seat for 11 minutes without starting the engine. I have a clear memory of the parking lot asphalt in September afternoon light, the particular gray tan of it, the oil stain near the yellow line of the space next to mine that had been there since at least my second year working there. I drove home. I did not call anyone. I made dinner. I went to bed. I did not sleep. The years leading up to that morning had a shape that I could see clearly only in retrospect, the way you can read the weather in a landscape once the storm has already come. The exclusion had not been sudden. It had been architectural. Renata had built it the way you build a load-bearing wall, one course at a time, with deliberate placement, with attention to what the structure needed to hold. The first year, I was the new young one, and the family's diminishment of my contributions was ordinary enough to pass for standard professional hazing. I was given the tasks that no one wanted. I managed vendor complaints, which at a catering operation is approximately what managing sewage systems is to a city's infrastructure, essential, ceaseless, and utterly invisible when you are doing it correctly. I processed payroll discrepancies. I answered the phone on Saturdays. I covered the floor at events when staff called out. I did all of this without the assistance of a formal job description, which meant I had no documented authority for anything I was actually doing and no protection when someone else took credit for its outcomes. I understood this in the abstract, but not yet in its specific applications to my particular situation. I thought hard work was a form of self-defense. I was wrong about that. By my third year, I had developed something the family had not anticipated. Institutional knowledge so specific and so deep that the business functioned around me the way water organizes itself around a stone. I knew which vendors required a personal call rather than an email to turn around a late shipment. I knew which rental equipment companies double-charged for breakage and which ones required documented inventory sign-off at the close of every event, or they would bill you for items that had never left their warehouse. I knew the seasonal staffing rhythms, the corporate accounts that required 90 days of relationship management before they would agree to a contract renewal, the neighborhoods in the city where parking and load-in logistics would eat your labor budget if you didn't plan for them in the quote. I had built a functional intelligence system out of nothing, in my own time, documented in a series of operational notebooks I kept in a locked drawer in my desk. Notebooks with olive green covers, purchased in packs of 3 from an office supply chain, at $4.67 each. I had 12 of them by the time I left. My wardrobe at the office had been a quiet concession I had made early and never fully revisited. I wore dark trousers in navy or charcoal, simple blouses in neutral colors, flat shoes, nothing that required maintenance or announced itself in a room. I had learned without being explicitly taught that in environments where your value is being actively minimized, visible effort in self-presentation reads as competition. And competition in a workplace controlled by a woman like Renata was something you did not initiate unless you were prepared to absorb the consequences. I dressed to remain functional and forgettable in the best possible sense, present, professional, and not a provocation. The only consistent exception was a small brass-toned watch with a cream face and a thin leather strap, my grandfather's gift to me the year I started, which I wore every day and which I understood to be the one visible thing that connected me, in the family record, to him. The exclusion had its rhythms and its vocabularies. There were the meetings I was not invited to. There were the client relationships I was told, mid-relationship, that Derek would be taking over. There was the performance review at the end of my 4th year in which Renata told me, with the measured tone of someone delivering a professional assessment, that I had what she called an execution gift, but lacked strategic vision. 2 terms she deployed with a precision that I eventually recognized as designed. Execution gift, acknowledge the labor without acknowledging its value, and strategic vision was the quality she had decided to reserve, in her professional vocabulary, exclusively for the people she intended to elevate. I did not contest this. I noted it. I continued. The business grew during those years, and I want to be precise about this, because precision is the antidote to the story Renata preferred to tell, the story in which she was the architect of everything and the rest of us were interchangeable labor. In the fiscal year that included my 5th and 6th years at the company, operating revenue increased from $840,000 to $1,260,000. I can document my direct contribution to $322,000 of that growth across new account acquisition, contract renegotiation, and cost reduction initiatives. I documented it at the time, in those olive green notebooks, not because I was planning anything in particular, but because I had been raised by a grandfather who believed that documentation was a form of respect for your own effort. I would later be grateful for this habit in ways I could not have anticipated. The jewelry accusation, when it came, did not come from nowhere. It came from a direction I had not fully calculated, which is the only reason it stunned me. I had anticipated that Renata would eventually find a mechanism to remove me from the business. I had not calculated that the mechanism would be criminal in its framing. I had prepared for professional erasure. I was not prepared to be made into a story. Renata's jewelry collection was known within the family as a kind of running reference point, a measure of the family's prosperity as she chose to narrate it. The piece that mattered to the accusation was a bracelet, yellow gold, Italian chain construction, set with 5 small inset emeralds, purchased during a trip to a trade show in Miami approximately 9 years before the conference room morning. She had mentioned this bracelet on multiple occasions, always in contexts where she was establishing her own discernment, the craftsmanship, the provenance. The specific jeweler on a street in a neighborhood, she pronounced with a careful accuracy that communicated she knew exactly where she had been and expected you to be impressed by this. The bracelet had been appraised at $11,200. I know this figure because she had told it to my mother, who had relayed it to my father, who had mentioned it in passing at a Sunday dinner 3 years before the accusation, in the mild, slightly baffled way my father mentioned most things that involved money above a certain threshold, as if larger numbers were interesting weather phenomena. $11,200. I filed the number without knowing why. The accusation itself, as I eventually reconstructed it, had begun as a whisper in the cousin network approximately 3 weeks before it reached me formally. I had a cousin on Patricia's side, a woman named Luz Ferreira, who had maintained a tentative and largely private friendship with me across the years of family politics, the kind of friendship that exists in text messages and the occasional lunch and a mutual, unspoken agreement never to discuss the central tensions directly. Luz was the person the family thought least of, professionally and personally, She had left a corporate marketing position 4 years earlier to run a small alterations and tailoring business out of a space she rented in a commercial strip near her apartment, a decision the family had processed as evidence of a certain deficiency of ambition. They were wrong about her, as they were wrong about a number of things. She was the most careful reader of people I had ever encountered, and her tailoring business, which the family dismissed, grossed $208,000 the previous year, which I knew because she had told me, and I believed her and found it quietly wonderful. Luz had sent me a text message on a Thursday evening 3 weeks before the conference room. The message said only, "I heard something tonight at dinner that you need to know. Call me when you're somewhere private." I had called her from my car, parked in my own building's garage, windows up, engine off. She told me that at a family dinner at Patricia's house that evening, Renata had said, in the middle of what Luz described as an otherwise ordinary conversation about the upcoming holiday event calendar, that she was almost certain she knew what had happened to the Miami bracelet and that she was not going to make accusations without talking to the right people first, and that the whole thing was very sad when it was someone you trusted. She had not named me at that table. She had not needed to. By the following morning, according to Luz's account of the subsequent text message chain she had been included on, my name was circulating. I did not panic. I set the phone face down on my kitchen counter after the call, pressed my fingertips flat against the countertop, and held them there for 30 seconds, feeling the cold of the stone. The specific solidity of a surface that does not move regardless of what is happening above it. Then I made a cup of tea. Then I sat down and thought carefully about what I was actually dealing with. I was dealing with a woman who had decided that the cost of removing me from the family structure had become worth paying, and who had identified a mechanism that was simultaneously unverifiable in both directions and deeply effective in the court of family opinion. She had chosen a criminal framing because it was the category that most effectively suspended people's critical reasoning, the category that caused otherwise sensible people to think, well, I don't know, you never really know someone, do you? She had chosen jewelry because it was intimate, portable, deniable, and specifically hers in the family mythology. And she had chosen me because I was the one she needed gone, the one whose institutional knowledge and quiet accumulation of competence had become, in her calculus, the primary obstacle to the version of succession she was engineering for Derek. I understood all of this with a clarity that surprised me, sitting in my kitchen at 11:17 at night, and the clarity itself told me something important. She had not chosen this approach because I had made a mistake. She had chosen it because I had not made any. She needed an accusation precisely because there was no fact. The formal accusation, the conference room warning, came 3 weeks after Luz's call. I had not spent those 3 weeks defending myself or reaching out to family members or attempting to manage the narrative. I had spent them paying attention. This is where I have to tell you about something I did not plan to find and was not looking for on the specific afternoon I found it. It was a Wednesday, approximately 12 days before the conference room meeting, and I was in the storage office at the back of the Garfield Avenue location doing what I did approximately twice a month, which was reconciling the physical catering equipment inventory against the insurance rider documentation we kept for that location's policy. This was one of the tasks that had existed in my informal portfolio for years, another invisible maintenance function that no one supervised and no one tracked except through its absence when it was not done. I was cross-referencing the insurance documentation against the equipment binder when I needed to access the digital file version of the current rider, which was stored in the shared drive under a folder path I had been using for 4 years. I found the folder. I opened it. And I found, in addition to the current insurance rider I had been looking for, a second document that should not have been there, and that I had not placed there, and that, based on the file's creation date and the user account associated with it, had been uploaded 11 days earlier by Derek Calloway. The document was a transfer of management authorization. I did not open it immediately. I stood at the desk in the back storage office, in the low light of that room, the smell of chafing dish cleaner and folded tablecloths around me, and I made myself breathe normally for approximately 45 seconds. Then I opened it. It was a 2-page internal document on Van and Strickland letterhead. It bore my grandfather's name as the founding authority of the business. It purported to be a previously undisclosed management directive that reassigned controlling operational signatory authority to Renata Calloway and, upon her eventual retirement or incapacitation, to Derek Calloway, to the exclusion of all other equity holders. The document was dated 13 years prior. The notarization block at the bottom bore a seal and a number. The signature line attributed to my grandfather read Gerald E. Van in handwriting I had seen on hundreds of documents across my life. I looked at that signature for a long time. I had grown up watching my grandfather sign things. I had watched him sign checks and letters and the birthday cards he wrote to each grandchild individually, without delegation, every year until he died. I knew the forward lean of his capital G, the way the loop of the E in his middle initial sat slightly higher than the baseline, the pressure he put into the final letters of Van that made the double N sit close together and slightly slanted. I did not know graphology. I was not an expert in document authentication. But I knew his signature. And the signature on this document was not his. I did not print the document. I did not screenshot it from my own account. I did not touch it in any way that would register my interaction with it in the file system. I closed the folder. I found the insurance rider I had originally come for. I finished the inventory reconciliation. I locked the storage office at 4:51 in the afternoon. I said goodnight to the 2 staff members remaining in the kitchen. I drove home. That evening at 7:45, I sent a single text message to Luz Ferreira. It said, "Do you still have your contact at that law firm your client uses? The one you mentioned last spring." She responded in 4 minutes. She said, "Okafor and Associates?" "Yes." "Why?" I set the phone down. I picked it up again. I typed, "I think I'm going to need to make an appointment." Luz sent me a phone number. Then she sent a second message that said, "Cecily, whatever you found, don't touch it. Don't move anything. Just wait." I stared at that message for a long time, in the quiet of my apartment, the city outside my window going about its ordinary business, entirely unaware of the thing that had just shifted on its axis in a back storage room on Garfield Avenue. I typed back, "I already know that." And then, "The person I need to speak with may already know who I am." The appointment with Okafor and Associates was not for another 9 days, and I want you to understand what those 9 days felt like. Because the texture of waiting when you know something and cannot yet use it is a specific kind of weight that I had never carried before at that particular density. I went to work. I processed invoices. I coordinated the linen delivery for a corporate holiday pre-event that was still 6 weeks out. I answered emails. I said good morning to people who had begun, in those 3 weeks since the whisper had started moving through the family network, to answer my good mornings with a quality of hesitation that was new and unmistakable. A fractional pause before the response that communicated, without words, that they were now calibrating how to interact with me. I noticed all of it. I filed all of it. I did not change my behavior by a single visible degree. The quarterly shareholder meeting had been scheduled for the second Thursday of October for the better part of a year. It was a fixture, a ritual in the life of the business that my grandfather had instituted in the early years as a way of ensuring that every branch of the family with an equity stake remained informed and nominally included, regardless of whether they were operationally involved. He had believed in transparency as a structural principle, not a courtesy. The meetings were held in the main conference room of the Garfield Avenue location, which was also used for high-end client consultations and private event planning sessions, and which Renata had, over the years, gradually redecorated to reflect her own aesthetic preferences rather than the original functional warmth my grandfather had favored. The room was now a composition of charcoal and cream, with a long oval table in dark walnut veneer, leather chairs in a gray that aspired to corporate seriousness, and a framed architectural rendering of the building on one wall that no one had ever ordered, but that Renata had commissioned as part of a rebranding exercise 4 years earlier at a cost I had processed the invoice for, $3,700, paid to a design firm whose primary client was a real estate developer, not a catering company. I arrived at 8:42 in the morning. The meeting was scheduled for 9. I want to describe the room as I walked into it. Because the visual record of that morning is one I have returned to many times, and because the contrast that presented itself when I stepped through that door was so complete and so precisely arranged that it had the quality of a set. Something constructed rather than simply occupied. Renata was already seated at the head of the table. She was wearing a charcoal blazer I had not seen before, a new variation in the rotation, this one in a fabric with a subtle herringbone structure that caught the overhead light with a restrained shimmer. Her silver chignon was perfect. She had a leather portfolio open in front of her, a fountain pen uncapped to its right, a ceramic coffee cup at her left, and the overall arrangement communicated, with an efficiency that I had to admire despite myself, that she had been sitting there long enough to establish the room as hers. She wore her gold watch, the wide-faced one with the champagne dial that she referred to occasionally as her working watch, as opposed to the other one, which she kept for what she called important evenings. On her left wrist she wore the Miami bracelet. The yellow gold, the 5 inset emeralds. $11,200 of Italian craftsmanship resting on her wrist in this room. On this morning, the bracelet she had told the family was missing, worn openly in front of every person she had told. I registered this. I set my bag on the chair I had occupied at this table for 7 years, second from the left along the long side, never at the head, never adjacent to the head. I placed a single eagle notepad in front of me, a pen, and the small brass-toned watch from my grandfather, which I had removed from my wrist that morning before leaving the apartment and placed in the front pocket of my bag, and which I now set in the upper right corner of my notepad as I always did when I needed to track time precisely. I was wearing dark navy trousers and a cream blouse. Nothing that announced itself. Nothing that competed. Derek arrived at 8:51, with the particular energy of someone who had been told in advance that today was a day to perform confidence. He was in a suit. He did not normally wear suits to shareholder meetings. This one was a medium blue, fitted, with a lapel pin I did not recognize, something small and gold. He said, "Good morning, everyone, good morning," and then, scanning the room, brother, early as always, to the room at large, which at that moment contained only myself, his mother, and his Uncle Thomas, who had materialized in the corner chair nearest the door at some point I had not tracked, in the way my father always materialized in rooms, without entrance, simply present. Thomas Van was wearing what he always wore, dark pants and a collared shirt in a muted plaid, and he had both hands around his coffee cup in the way he held coffee cups when he was managing discomfort, as a prop, as a something to do with the hands. Patricia arrived at 8:58 with a young cousin I will not name here, a 23-year-old who had recently joined the business in a junior capacity and who had no procedural reason to be at a shareholder meeting, but whose presence I understood, the moment I saw her, as intentional. An audience. Padding. A warm body who could be counted on to read the room and mirror the dominant frequency. At 9:03, the door to the conference room opened again, and Renata said, without looking up from her portfolio, "Go ahead and close that, Derek," and Derek closed it. And the sound of its sealing had the specific acoustic quality of a conference room door closing on a room that has been arranged in advance for a particular outcome. She began with business, or what presented as business. Revenue summaries for the previous quarter. Vendor updates. She moved through these items with a briskness that communicated they were not the point of the morning. My father touched the collar of his shirt once, a short, precise touch, and returned his hand to his coffee cup. Derek took notes with the pen he always used, a heavy chrome ballpoint, clicking it once between each item in a rhythm so consistent it had to be unconscious. Click, note, the metronome of a man performing diligence. 22 minutes in, Renata set her fountain pen down parallel to the edge of the portfolio. This was a gesture I had seen before. It meant the transition from agenda to intention. She said, "There is one additional item we need to address today as a family and as a company. It concerns the integrity of the business and a matter that has come to my attention over the past several weeks." She did not look at me when she said this. She looked at the table. The room had a quality I can only describe as pre-pressurized, The way the air in a car feels different when the windows are all the way up on a warm day, a contained, circulated density. She said, "It has come to my attention that certain company assets have been accessed and possibly removed without authorization by someone within our operations. Given the sensitivity of this matter and the family relationships involved, I have tried to address it privately before bringing it to this table. I have not been able to reach a satisfactory resolution through private conversation. So I am addressing it here now in front of the people who have a stake in this company and in this family's name." My father touched his collar. A longer touch this time. Derek clicked his pen. Once. I set my own pen down across my notepad and folded my hands on the table and looked at her steadily. She still had not looked at me. Patricia made a sound, a small, indrawn breath, a performance of reluctant witness that I noted and set aside. Then Renata looked at me. She looked at me the way you look at something you have decided the cost of. Completely. Without blinking. "Blood or not," she said, "a thief is a thief." She said it with that particular smile. The one that stopped at the cheekbones. I did not look away. I did not move my hands from the table. I did not let the air out of my lungs in any way that would register as a response. What I did, with a precision I was deeply grateful for in that moment, was redirect my gaze to the Miami bracelet on her wrist, hold it there for precisely 2 seconds, and then return my eyes to her face, neutral, open, entirely quiet. It was the smallest possible gesture. She saw it. I know she saw it because the smile, for the first time in that morning, shifted, a microsecond of recalibration behind the eyes, a flicker of recalculation that was there and gone before anyone else in that room could have caught it. Then she continued. She said the jewelry was not the only concern. She said there had been questions raised about financial irregularities in accounts I had access to. She said this was a company matter and a family matter, and that going forward, my access to operational systems and financial accounts would be suspended pending a review. She said she had asked a consulting firm to conduct an audit. She said all of this in the measured cadence of a woman who had rehearsed it to the point where it no longer required her to feel it, which meant she had rehearsed it many times. Derek said, without clicking his pen, which was a notable absence, "I think we all just want this handled right. For the company. For everyone." He addressed this to the room as though offering a reasonable mediation, as though the room contained a debate rather than a verdict. "Brother," he said. "We're all just brother to Derek." Patricia said, "Cecily, sweetheart," in a tone that contained both pity and finality, which is a remarkable combination and requires real skill to achieve. No one wants this to be what it is. But Renata has to protect the business. My father said nothing. He was looking at the table. His right hand, the one not holding the coffee cup, touched the collar of his shirt and did not come back down. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because imprecision would be a kind of dishonesty that the rest of this story does not deserve. I did not feel humiliated. I had moved past the possibility of humiliation from these particular people some time earlier without quite marking the date. What I felt was something closer to a flat, clear, interior recognition, the sensation of watching a structure you have studied for a long time finally reveal its final shape. I had known the load-bearing walls. I had understood the foundation. And now I could see the complete blueprint, every room, every door that was designed not to open. I felt my grandfather's watch under my right hand, the small round edge of it where it rested in the corner of my notepad. I pressed one fingertip against the crystal face, feeling the slight elevation of the glass above the brass bezel. My grandfather had worn this watch for 30 years. His wrist had warmed it every day of those 30 years. It was 100% operational, kept time accurately, had been serviced once, a repair that cost $42 at a watchmaker on Clement Street who had cleaned the movement and told my grandfather it would run indefinitely if you let it. I picked it up. I placed it on my wrist. I fastened the strap with the quiet efficiency of someone who has no further business at the table. I said, "Thank you for making this clear." I said it to the room, not to her specifically. I said it in the register of a closing statement, not a concession. Then I stood, collected my notepad and pen, and picked up my bag. No one spoke. My father did not look up. I walked to the conference room door, opened it, walked through it, and let it close behind me in the ordinary way doors close, without any particular emphasis, without any drama, simply shut. They thought that was the ending. They had arranged the room for an ending, dressed for an ending, practiced their lines for an ending, and when I walked out of that room, what they felt, I am certain, was the specific satisfaction of people who have successfully concluded a piece of work. They would have relaxed, fractionally, into their chairs. Renata would have recapped her fountain pen. Derek would have clicked his chrome ballpoint once, a period at the end of a sentence. Patricia would have sighed the gentle sigh of someone relieved that an unpleasant duty has been discharged. And my father would have kept his eyes on the table for a moment longer than the others, his fingers at his collar, and then let his hand drop, and said nothing, and had more coffee. And they thought that was the ending. The corridor outside the conference room ran the length of the Garfield Avenue building from the main entrance to the back kitchen and storage area. I had walked it thousands of times. I knew every variance in the fluorescent overhead lighting, the section near the supply closet where one tube had a fractional flicker that no one had ever repaired because it was not quite bad enough to prioritize. The way the floor changed from the tile of the front-of-house area to the sealed concrete of the operational corridor at a seam that ran just past the third door on the left. I walked its full length at my normal pace, not hurried, not slow. I passed the kitchen, where 2 morning prep staff were working, and I said good morning to them, and they said good morning to me, and this small exchange was the only moment in that entire morning when I was spoken to as a person rather than a problem to be managed. I went to my desk. The olive green notebooks were in the locked drawer at the lower right, where they had always been. I had 11 in the drawer at that point, the 12th having been started recently and kept at home. I unlocked the drawer, took out the 11 notebooks, placed them in the canvas tote bag I kept under my desk for this specific purpose, and locked the empty drawer. I then disconnected my personal external hard drive from the rear USB port of the desktop computer at my workstation, the drive I had purchased myself, a small matte black unit the size of a thick card, registered to my personal account and not the company network, on which I had kept copies of certain categories of work documentation as a personal professional record. I placed this in my bag with the notebooks. I looked at my desk for a moment. The surface was clean. There had never been personal items on it beyond the notebooks. I had worked, for 7 years, at a desk that contained no evidence of me as a person, only the operational materials of the function I performed. I thought about my grandfather's line. A reckoning doesn't arrive when you call for it. It arrives when it's ready. Your job is to still be standing when it gets there. I picked up my bag. I stood. I walked out. My car was in the same space in the parking lot where the oil stain near the yellow line had always been. I got in. I started the engine immediately, which was different from the 11 minutes of sitting I had done at this same car in this same lot on the afternoon of the pre-accusation day. I had no need to sit. I knew exactly where I was going, and I knew exactly what I needed to do before I got there. I drove to a copy shop on Farwell Avenue that opened at 8 in the morning and closed at 9 at night, a business I had used occasionally for large format printing jobs related to work, and which I now used for a different purpose. I printed specific pages from the external hard drive, pages I had identified and flagged in the 3 days since finding the transfer document on the shared drive, and I printed them with 2 clean copies of each, placed one set in a manila envelope I purchased at the counter, sealed and labeled it, and placed it in my bag. At 11:14 in the morning, I called Luz Ferreira from my car. She answered on the second ring. I said, "The meeting happened." She said, "I know. My mother just texted me." A pause. "Are you all right?" I said, "I need to know if the appointment with Okafor and Associates is confirmed." A different kind of pause. The kind that means someone is recalibrating what they understand about a situation. Then she said, "It's confirmed. Thursday at 2. Do you want me to come with you?" I considered this. I said yes, but not as family. As someone who was in the room 3 weeks ago when a specific conversation happened. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Cecily. Just my name. The way you say someone's name when you are trying to communicate something that does not have a shorter form." I said, "I know." She said, okay. Thursday at 2. I hung up and sat with both hands on the steering wheel in the Farwell Avenue copy shop parking lot. It was 11:22 in the morning. The sky had the particular white-gray of a Midwestern October sky, overcast without drama, a working sky. I thought about the 11 olive green notebooks in the canvas tote bag in the back seat. I thought about the transfer document I had viewed and not touched, sitting in a shared digital folder in a company system I no longer had access to as of this morning, access suspended as Renata had announced it would be, which meant the document was preserved exactly as it was, time-stamped with Derek's credentials and the date of his upload, in a system I no longer had any capability to alter even if I had wanted to, which I did not, which was precisely the point. Which was the only reason. I had decided not to raise any alarm about that document before this morning's meeting. She had locked me out of the system, and in doing so, she had locked the evidence in. I drove home. I made lunch. I ate it at my kitchen table with the manila envelope and my grandfather's watch in front of me, and I reviewed, for the last time before Thursday, the full shape of what I understood and what I still needed to know. Wallace Okafor and Associates. A name Luz had mentioned once, in passing, the previous spring, in the context of a client of hers, a woman who owned a small flower and event styling business who had been in a commercial lease dispute. Luz had said at the time, her attorney is extraordinary. Old school.